And the crowning moment of a visit to Atlantic City was a Saturday night where people would get dressed up in their finest clothes and they would hire someone to push them down the boardwalk.
Now, so on the boardwalk, along the land side of the boardwalk, you
Yeah.
have hotels
Right.
and ice shops and amusements. Now, and then on the ocean side, there are these piers that
Yeah.
extend out into the water. And we're not talking about fishing piers, right? Explain what was there.
They were entertainment piers. The most famous by far is Steel Pier. And Steel Pier, as one person said, went so far that it seemed to go all the way to Spain. And on that pier, for one price, somebody could watch 3 or 4 movies. You could look at an incubator baby. And perhaps the most famous act on Steel Pier was the diving horse in a place at the end of the boardwalk where a woman dove a horse into a pool of water. And people watched, and again, it was the kind of attempt to pull you out of everyday reality. I mean, none of us see a diving horse in our everyday lives.
How big a deal was Atlantic City back then?
Atlantic City in the 30s, just as the Depression hit, attracted 16 million people a year. It's about half of what Vegas attracts now, but the country was a quarter of the size that it is now. This was a mass resort in its heyday. Atlantic City during this period is a kind of remarkable city of firsts. It is the place where saltwater taffy is invented, which has no salt water in it. It is the place where the Miss America pageant starts. It's where the CIO of the AFL-CIO is born, and also where Martin and Lewis first start performing. And of course, it lends its street names to the most famous board game in American history, Monopoly.
How did Atlantic City change from its heyday through the 40s, 50s, and 60s?
It's interesting. 1955 marks the opening of Disneyland in California, and I think that's both an interesting date and an interesting moment. It speaks to the kind of movement of the American population away from the great kind of industrial centers of the Northeast and the Midwest of California, and Disneyland is in a suburban location. That's telling for Atlantic City, because if we go back and think about what made Atlantic City, it was a place of fantasy, a place where recent immigrants could come to show that they had made it in America. Part of that making it in America was that it was confined to whites only, in a sense. And Atlantic City in some ways suffers from white flight, as its segregation in Atlantic City breaks down, and it was a largely segregated city, both in terms of residents and in terms of access to the boardwalk and the hotels. As that breaks down, whites leave both the city itself and the tourism section of it. Race is crucial both to the making and unmaking of Atlantic City, as it is to many American metropolitan areas.
When did you first go to Atlantic City?
I first went to Atlantic City probably in the early 1970s. My clearest memory is actually going to Gordon's Alley to buy my bar mitzvah suit, which was interesting, right? I grew up in a South Jersey town, Vineland, and the kind of pool was not to Philadelphia as it was even 6 or 7 years later when I was in high school. The pool was to Atlantic City. That was the kind of metropole that my parents went to in order to buy fancy things.
What was Atlantic City like in the early 70s when people were saying, this is a dying town and we need something like gambling to revive it? What did it look like? What did it
Yeah, so the late 50s into the 60s were pretty hard on Atlantic City. And, you know, kind of increasingly the crowds were gone. The crowds in the past, maybe one way to contrast that is the crowds in the past, in the kind of heyday of Atlantic City, would dress to the nines. By the 60s and 70s, people were wearing cutoff shorts and sleeveless T-shirts on the boardwalk. It used to be that you couldn't walk on the boardwalk in a bathing suit. There were little tunnels built under it because you didn't want to violate the propriety of the boardwalk. All that was off by the 1960s and into the early 1970s. And there was a joke that people were telling that you could roll a bowling ball down the boardwalk in the height of the summer and not hit anyone. And this gets back to one of the kind of central points about Atlantic City. Its urbanity, its size and scale exaggerated its loss. It began to kind of wear thin, and there was a kind of emptiness that was powerful to people and in many ways invoked the crisis of the town, and city leaders were desperate. They were desperate to revive the past, to bring back these well-dressed, middle-class tourists who wanted to come to show off. And in some ways, they didn't understand that the market had changed. And in some ways, they had a tough sell, right? There were all this competition at this point from, you know, ex-urban amusement parks to Disneyland to cheap airfare taking people to Miami and the Bahamas. And those tensions were, again, going to be hard to resolve.
So if you walk down Atlantic City in the 70s before gambling comes, you don't see, you know, mink stoles being sold at fancy shops. You see, what do you see on the boardwalk?
Well, the funny thing about Atlantic City in that period is you see a little bit of the past. So if you're walking down the boardwalk in the 1970s, you might just see a mink stole store, but it wouldn't have much business. And next to it might be a place selling 2 hot dogs for $1, right? It was the lack of a cohesive narrative that the older boardwalk have told had been sort of pulled apart by these challenges.
You know, it's interesting that when gambling comes to Atlantic City in 1978, for years they hold a monopoly. It's the only place you can gamble east of the Mississippi. And when I think about that, I think surely out of all the bountiful revenues that came from that, Atlantic City should have the best schools, the best roads, the best water system. Obviously it doesn't. I mean, it's a financial basket case today. And I want to talk about why that is a bit. Atlantic City had the ocean, tremendous asset, and with gambling, it would seem it could combine a great family...
And a boardwalk.
Right, and the amusements. It could be a family resort and a gambling resort. And I want to talk about the way that the casinos developed and why that somehow didn't happen. What about the construction of the casinos and the hotels and the way they did or did not, you know, generate other development and activity?
Well, let's just talk about gambling first as an activity. What's the point of gambling from the perspective of the casino owner? It's to take all your money, right? Then we add the way they built their buildings. They literally built the buildings to trap people inside. Famously, there were no signs that pointed to the boardwalk or the ocean. It was easier to get to the slot machine than it was to find the door out onto the boardwalk. And as casinos developed in Atlantic City, they also realized that most of their business would come from buses and cars. And they essentially built parking decks that reached as far out as they could to the main drags of the city, to the expressways that would bring people into the city. And they were almost operated like suction cups. They would suck in the cars, park them, and lead people over the city, literally on walkways, the kind of walkways you see in Minneapolis to keep you out of the cold, to get you into the casinos. And then when it was time to leave, you would take the walkway back. In the meantime, while you were in the casino, were nationally known restaurants subsidized by casino profits so that they were cheaper than the local restaurants, subsidized drinks, and as people know, that drinks in casinos are pretty stiff, that were free. And how the small Italian restaurant, how were they going to compete with a place like this? They couldn't give away meals, they couldn't subsidize their drinks, and they didn't have free parking.
The old Atlantic City there were hotels, but they were of a certain scale. I mean, there were 3, 4, 5 stories, and they had this elegant architecture. What sort of structures did we see as casinos developed?
Yeah, those old buildings of Atlantic City are fascinating because they were ornate and decorated on the outside. And as you know, an ornate and decorated building on the outside says the people who walk by matter, that the public space matters, right? And the casinos that were built in Atlantic City at first, other than resorts, Caesars, Trump's Plaza, Bally's, were essentially looked like Holiday Inns. And what they said to people was, everything interesting is on the inside. And they created, in a sense, an architecture that negates the public space. I mean, why walk down the boardwalk if the buildings along the boardwalk aren't there to entertain you as they were in the past? And so I think this is all part and parcel of this kind of casino development that's about creating, in a sense, 11 rocket ships that kind of land on the lunar surface of urban Atlantic City and say everything that matters happens inside of them.
So eventually there were 12 casinos in Atlantic City, and they surely generated a ton of revenue. It must have sent a lot of tax revenue to the city. And there was also this casino, the Casino Reinvestment Development Agency, which was supposed to take a piece of casino earnings and use that money for projects in the city. Surely that was an opportunity to transform Atlantic City. What happened to that?
One would think so, right? I mean, a city of 40,000 people, attracting somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 million visitors a year, could skim off enough to build flagship schools, playgrounds that would be the envy of the world. And that's not what happened. What happened was some of the money did go back into the city, but not nearly enough. Most of the money went back into fueling the casino industry.
Well, Brian Simon, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Bryant Simon is a professor of history at Temple University. His book is Boardwalk of Dreams, Atlantic City and the Fate of Urban America. After a break, reporter Amy Rosenberg tells us how Atlantic City is coping with the collapse of casino revenues and about the eccentric developer who bought the city's largest casino at a fire sale price. I'm Dave Davies, and this is Fresh Air.
And you're listening to Fresh Air on WNYC. It's day 2 of our winter fund drive here, and we remind you how much your support matters to us. I'm Julianne Welby from the newsroom, and I'm joined by Manoush Zomorodi of Note to Self.
Hi, Julianne. How are you?
Great. So what do we do to get people to go to the phones and say, yes, I love fresh air?
Okay, so here's what you got to do. And this is also a way to stay warm because as we are speaking right now, Julianne, the temperature is dropping. Don't be fooled. Spring is not around the corner. So show your support of WNYC because when you make a donation of $96 or just $8 a month, we will thank you with our newest thank you gift. This is the WNYC knit hat. It's a one-size-fits-all black knit hat that features a red WNYC logo. You can be among the first in New York to sport the hat by donating now. It is super spiffy. I've seen people modeling it around the station. They look really good. And today only, Julianne, we will throw in the iconic WNYC Eco Tote with that contribution of $8 a month. So call now to support WNYC and all of the programs, including Fresh Air, that you love so much. Call 1-888-376-9692 or pledge online at WNYC.org.
Whatever you choose to give, you are supporting Fresh Air. All the great conversations you hear, whether it's about Atlantic City or a sit down with one of your favorite musicians. And here's a song about someone you know right now. Take a listen.
Some listeners can't imagine starting their day without WNYC. It seems like something out of a bad dream. Satirius Johnson, waking at 3 to arrive at the mic before dawn. Something is wrong. Satirius Johnson finds that the station is closed. There's a note on the sash. Ran out of cash. All the morning people, where will they all begin? All the morning people, to whom will they tune in? Help make sure WNYC is there every morning and all day long. Go to WNYC.org and click on Donate. Satirius Johnson wanders the streets in a daze. He's as pale as a ghost. Nothing to host. Stumbling home now, Satirius crawls into bed to consider his fate. It's not even 8. Oh, look at all the morning people. Oh, look at all the morning people.
That is the first, Julianne, that is the first time I've ever heard that song. And if you are as tickled and terrified
And saddened. Our colleague Satirius, somebody help him out.
the thought of him not being here in the morning, if it fills you with terror, make that call. 1-888-376-9692. Call now to support WNYC and Satirius Johnson. All the people in the morning and the people in the afternoon, like Julianne Welby sitting across from me right now. You can also pledge online at WNYC.org. And when you decide to pledge just $8 a month, we're going to thank you with our newest gift. It's that black knit hat. You look so cool, like simple yet sophisticated. You like public radio, but you don't have to shout about it. You just put it on your head.
It goes great with that eco tote as well.
That's a look right there.
Very
for sure.
understated. Wear your WNYC around town with pride, but first you have to make the phone call to become a member. It's 888-376-9692, 888-376-WNYC to begin or renew your membership, to grab the hat, grab the eco tote at once.
And you can actually see Satirius wearing the hat if you go to the pledge page now. And if that's not an incentive, I really don't know what is. So go to WNYC.org. Go there right now as you hear Eleanor Rigby, Satirius Johnson ringing in your ears, or call 1-888-376-9692. Becoming a monthly sustainer is the most convenient, cost-effective way to support WNYC. So decide to give that pledge of $8 a month. It adds up to just $96 a year. You get the hat, you get the tote, you make Julianne happy.
I'm smiling.
She's smiling.
And I'm giving you the phone number if you missed it. It's 888-376-9692. You can pledge online at WNYC.org. We're going to keep making radio, podcasts, a beautiful website at WNYC.org. We're going to keep paying for our subscription to Fresh Air because of your member dollars. 888-376-9692. Ask about the new knit hat with the very understated red logo.
Yeah, it's cool actually. I gotta say, you look like, you know that look you give each other on the subway when you see someone with the tote? The hat's gonna be the new thing. 888-376-9692 or go to WNYC.org, and thank you so very much.
We appreciate it.
WNYC is supported by Bright Star, a new Broadway musical about the stories we tell and the ones we don't, featuring an original score by Steve Martin and Edie Brickell, directed by Walter Bobby, now in previews. Info and tickets at brightstarmusical.com. The New York Community Trust, helping generous New Yorkers fund the causes they love in their communities. What do you love? More at nycommunitytrust.org. WNYC and Radio Love Fest are supported by Joe and Diane Steinberg, helping to bring National Public Radio talent to perform live at BAM from March 10th through 12th. More at bam.org/radiolovefest.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Dave Davies in for Terry Gross, who's off this week. Today we're exploring the dire financial crisis and tough choices facing Atlantic City, New Jersey, a resort town that legalized gambling in the 1970s and for years saw huge crowds and big profits for the gaming industry. That prosperity left much of the city behind, though. Dilapidated houses and vacant stores stood in the shadows of giant casinos. And when other states finally legalized casino gambling, Atlantic City was in for a shock. Its casino revenues, which stood at $6 billion a year just 10 years ago, are now less than half that. 4 of the city's 12 casinos have closed, and officials are struggling to maintain city services. Our next guest is Amy Rosenberg, a veteran reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer based at the Jersey Shore. Amy Rosenberg, welcome to Fresh Air. A lot of people have seen the HBO series Boardwalk Empire, which portrays a very corrupt Atlantic City back in the 20s. In modern times, has this been a corrupt town?
In modern times, it has been a corrupt town. There's been a series of mayors who have gone to jail, but in the most recent times, it's kind of gotten away from that. But the HBO series portrays a big political boss who basically ruled the town, and that is a theme that is current to this day. There's all these bosses that want to rule Atlantic City, And so that dynamic is a big dynamic, is really since the start of Atlantic City. The people that live there, the people that work there, and then this layer of boss that wants to run the town.
Bosses from Trenton, bosses from elsewhere.
Right. So the big boss these days really is Governor Christie. He's in some ways the latter day Nucky Johnson, or Nucky Thompson, as HBO said. And at the height of Boardwalk Empire, Christie actually came down to Atlantic City. Boardwalk Empire had kind of just started. So Christie, it was 2010, Christie came to the boardwalk and basically said, we're taking over the tourism district. We're taking over the town. It was a big splash. Christie was popular, and they did. That was the state's first stab at taking over the town.
People who've seen Boardwalk Empire think of a guy who commits murder and is an organized crime figure. We're not talking about that kind of boss. We're talking about Governor Christie.
No, and the real Nucky Johnson was not violent like the HBO. But the tradition is political bosses who want to control things in Atlantic City. And there's just been a long history of politicians and real estate people and billionaires who all come to Atlantic City and think they can move the pieces around the board the way they want to.
Governor Christie is elected in 2009, takes office January of 2010, and at this point, Atlantic City's casino revenues were falling. It was clear the town was struggling. Christie comes down and has a plan. What does he want to do?
The state said, we're going to put all our resources toward controlling the center of the boardwalk, the Marina District, all the great stuff, and you guys worry about the neighborhoods. And at the time, it seemed like a real usurping of power. As it turned out, it was one of the first in a series of state interventions that have gotten really more onerous as time has gone on. But at the time, that was considered the state coming and taking over. But their results have really been mixed from that.
The plan was to spend money on a big marketing effort, in part,
Right.
to get tourists to come back. How were they going to do it? What were they going to tell the tourists?
Well, they did a lot of things. They spent $12 million on an art park, for instance, and they filled an empty lot with kind of obscure but significant artwork. The idea being, let's draw a different kind of tourist to Atlantic City. They also spent money on concerts, an air show, events. They came up with the Do AC marketing campaign, and they tried to make it a place that people wanted to go.
In other words, don't just gamble, but do Atlantic City, the whole experience. It's not just gamble.
Right.
And how did it go?
Basically, most of the casinos have expanded a little bit more of a restaurant town, more of a nightclub town. But in the end, they're looking for gamblers. And the gamblers really were going elsewhere.
So, not a dramatic increase in visitors or revenue from that?
No. In fact, the other thing that Governor Christie did is he wanted the Revel to be built. And he put a lot of state tax incentives that got the Revel, this $2 billion new casino, and he basically jump-started.
So the governor comes and says, we're going to take over the tourism district because we can't trust Atlantic City to manage it effectively, and we're going to put new money into marketing and get people coming to Atlantic City for all kinds of good reasons, and we're going to finish this huge new gleaming casino, the Revel. What made the Revel different? How was it supposed to be so important?
Well, the Revel was going to be the next generation of Atlantic City. It was going to be that resort that people came to do everything, and maybe they'd gamble, maybe they wouldn't, but it was going to be that new model of Atlantic City to create a new idea that young people would come to Atlantic City. They would go to the nightclub, they would go to the restaurant, and they would be rich. They would come from New York City, and they would stay for several days. And this was going to be this fantasy of making Atlantic City something really exciting.
Did it look different?
The Revel it's a hugely tall building. It's very glamorous. It was problematic from the start. They put their hotel lobby on the 11th floor. You walked in from the boardwalk through like a huge wind tunnel, and then you had to go up like 2 escalators to get to the casino floor. It was a strange building. It was also never truly finished. The center of it never got built, so at nighttime you could literally see through the center of this. They put a funny little giant golf ball on top of it. They never put its name on it, so it was kind of a strange place that kind of never really worked.
It was huge and very, very expensive. What was the price tag?
$2 billion.
All right, so we have this moment where Atlantic City is struggling. The governor says, we're going to put new money into marketing. We're going to make sure this huge, gleaming new casino opens. And it does open, right?
Oh yeah, it opens.
And then what happens?
Well, it opened and people took tours and said nice things about it, and excellent restaurants opened up. They had a great nightclub kind of around the edges, but their whole financial model was like a disaster. It was owned by an independent company. They had no book of gamblers, no database of gamblers, and they were kind of...
The kind of high-rolling gamblers.
Yeah, they were kind of snobby toward gamblers. They didn't honor the comps that people got at another casino. They didn't have a poker room. People went and kind of felt like they weren't really wanted. And they couldn't fill the building because they didn't have enough rooms. So the paradox of the Revel was that the nightclub, which was HQ, did very well. If you went to the Revel on a Saturday night, you saw young people partying. It was well known among the club. They had the best DJs. But, it was kind of like the sear around an undercooked steak.
You said they didn't have enough rooms? What do you mean?
Originally, Revel was going to be 2 towers. It was going to be twice as big. And it ended up being 1 tower with the middle of it never built out. So the middle of it is literally this internal wind tunnel, which contributed to their escalating energy costs, which was another issue that bankrupted the Revel.
Okay, so we have, at a time when Atlantic City is struggling, the fundamental problem is there are many places people can go besides Atlantic City to gamble. And this doesn't reverse any of that. And the big new Revel closes, right?
It closed. It was one of 4 casinos that closed in 2014.
Which was a terrible, terrible year for Atlantic City.
It was expected, but the reality of it was hard to watch.
Before we talk about that and what happens next, just talk about what became of the Revel itself, because it was such a unique project. It was, sold at auction?
Yeah, it went bankrupt while it was still open.
We'll also host the daily podcast at justatslate.com. Thanks as always.
You're welcome.
It's Here and Now.
Farmers raise the animals and grow the crops and feed the rest of us, but it is harder than it used to be.
Until the marketplace wants to incentivize me or send a clear signal, I'm going to sit on my hands, continue to raise the pigs as my father and grandfather did.
I'm Kai Rizdal, American farmers and the food conversation in this country. That is next time on Marketplace.
Marketplace follows Newsworks tonight at 6:30 this evening on WHYY.
I'm Jack Lepiarz. The Republican governor of Nevada, who is being vetted as a possible Supreme Court nominee, is taking himself out of consideration. Governor Brian Sandoval says while he's humbled to be considered, he is taking himself out of the running. Sandoval, a moderate, had been seen as a candidate who could possibly bypass promised Republican opposition of any candidate nominated by President Obama. A French court says authorities can evict migrants from a massive camp in the city of Calais, but cannot destroy it altogether. As many as 4,000 migrants have been living in tents and shacks for months, hoping to make it across the English Channel to Britain. Officials at a hospital in southern New Jersey are warning more than 200 patients that they may have been exposed to HIV or hepatitis B or C. Shore Medical Center in Summers Point says patients between June 2013 and September 2014 may have been exposed to an employee's blood because of drug tampering. You're listening to Here and Now.
Thanks for listening to Here and Now on WHYY. It's 2:39. Good afternoon. I'm Dave Heller. Stay with us for a look at the day's news on All Things Considered at 4. Then at 6 this evening on Newsworks Tonight, Rec centers in Philadelphia are in terrible shape. We'll learn what new Mayor Jim Kenney's administration plans on doing by way of improvements. Newsworks tonight, weeknights at 6 on WHYY.
The Association of Delaware Valley Independent Schools, ADVIS, supports WHYY. The Greater Delaware Valley region is home to 130 independent private schools. Each offers nurture and academic challenge, instruction in critical thinking and connected learning, and strong opportunities in sports and the arts. Financial aid is often available. To learn more, it's advis.org. ADVIS. Independent schools produce independent people.
Funding for Here and Now comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston. Curious.com with a 10-minute interview followed by daily bite-sized learning recommendations to measure and build people's CQ, or Curious Quotient. Curious.com/NPR, where people can learn something new every day. And Squarespace, providing tools to help people turn their passions into a business with a customizable e-commerce website. Squarespace also offers domains, hosting, and 24/7 support. Learn more at squarespace.com.
It's Here and Now. They've long been used for news coverage. They're increasingly being used by medical personnel, the military, and people with the means to use them to commute. Incoming, they are helicopters, although people who use them often call them airplanes. Over 7,000 of them, including Marine One, the president's, are made by Sikorsky, which has built the presidential helicopter since the days of Eisenhower, 1957 to be exact. Last November, Connecticut-based Sikorsky was acquired by defense giant Lockheed Martin, which instituted Dan Schultz, a former VP and GM of a Lockheed division, as Sikorsky's new president. In our ongoing segment, View from the Top, we speak to those who helm companies big and small. Today, Dan Schultz, who often literally helms the company product, he flies it, and now he's merging two cultures who've long worked together, but now one owns the other. Dan, welcome.
Well, thank you, Robin. I appreciate you having this interview with me.
Well, and we know Sikorsky is based in Stratford, Connecticut. It's very much involved in the community there. It runs, Boy and Girl Scout camping trips on its front lawn there. I mean, are there any cultural issues of blending one with the other?
I'd like to tell you about what I think is the core of our business with Lockheed and with Sikorsky, and that's about innovation and inspiration. Our founder, Igor Sikorsky, really put out the challenge of trying to save lives, and it's been our touchstone here. We have a saying that we bring people home everywhere, every time, and so it's something that we really believe in. So we have new products like the Raider, which is a helicopter that can break all the speed records going forward. We're pretty excited about those kind of development programs, and then also building the helicopter for the President of the United States.
Well, we know that in the fall you began the work on replacing the presidential helicopter. I want to ask you about that, but you say, one of the mottos, one of the missions is to bring everyone home every time. And as you well know, that doesn't always happen. And most recently, 2 helicopters collided, both were Sikorsky's. 12 Marines were killed. Now, there's no reason that's been found for that collision yet, but what happens to a company when that happens?
Well, I want you to know that that is the airplane that I flew when I was in the Marines, the 53E. And I want you to know that every person in Sikorsky feels the loss of that helicopter when they crashed. The results haven't been identified yet, and the accident investigation is still going on, but we immediately reached out to our customer and said, anything that we can do at Sikorsky to help, we're standing by and are supporting the military in their investigation.
It's got to be sickening.
It is always a difficult thing also for the families, and I want you to know that Sikorsky feels their pain just like the families do themselves. It's a tough time for everyone.
Yeah, well, with that in mind, we're reading about this huge burst in spending on helicopters in the military. The military is cutting back in so many other ways, but we'll be spending on helicopters as the Pentagon shifts to a more fleet-footed force. And when I'm doing some of the reading in the military journals, one of the concerns is that the creation of the helicopters is moving ahead of the people who are able to work on them because helicopters have become so advanced. Your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the good things about advancing the innovation in helicopters is we're also improving the reliability and maintainability of the helicopters, so it's easier for people to maintain them. And we're driving down the cost per hour of the helicopter. So we charge our folks here to come up with innovative ways to make things better. We have one of the most reliable helicopters in the commercial world with the S-92. We have an S-92 that has the same safety record as a commercial airline. So when you get on an S-92, it's just like if you were getting on a commercial airline commuting to Washington from Connecticut.
Well, speaking of which, I found an article from 1984 in the New York Times in which they talked about the use of helicopters by businesses increasing. You know, people, corporate executives with offices in the suburbs around New York City, relying on helicopters to get to the city and other places in the Northeast. And there was a lot of concern about the noise, about the safety. Are you concerned that the air is in certain corridors is getting too crowded?
Well, you know, it's like everything in the United States. Building helicopters for commercial use has been one of our goals in Sikorsky, and we have a company that provides service sort of like a NetJets. It's called AAG, where they actually can rent helicopters, charter helicopters to take people in and out of the city. There's a certain amount of satisfaction flying in a helicopter as you're going over a very crowded highway going into the city. I personally have flown the S-76D as one of our commercial helicopters, and you and I can sit in the back of that helicopter and talk just like this. It's so quiet, and it's almost like commuting to work in your car.
This is what we hear, as we said, you're doing the new replacement for the presidential helicopter, that it is so quiet that the president can speak in normal tones. How do you do that? How do you make it so quiet? I mean, I've been in helicopters over the years, and you have to wear the big headphones on them, you know, when you go out with, let's say, the Coast Guard to see a rescue mission, or you can't hear yourself think.
Exactly. Well, see, military helicopters are really designed for the maximum amount of lift that they can provide, and they have a different mission. So in the commercial helicopter world, we've taken rotor dampening down to a new level. We've worked on blade flap. That's the noise that the helicopter blades make. We've insulated the cabin, and we've really done a good job of making sure that the acoustic signature is so low. And we're working on sound deadening as well throughout the helicopter design.
What's your biggest concern about competitors?
Well, you know, it's not that we're indifferent to the market space, but what we believe in Sikorsky is taking our engineers and challenging us for the next generation. What are we going to do next, and how do we fill our customer needs? I was out there the other day, and we had an engineer walk up to me and said, hey, Dan, I'd like you to come out here and see an airplane we have, an S-76. It's sitting out here on the runway. He picked up an iPad, pushed the button, airplane started up. He moved the little cursor on the iPad. The airplane came into a hover. I hate to admit that it actually hovered better than I think I could hover, and then moved it around the airfield and then landed it.
Well, it's